Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Tips and Tricks in Acumen Risk. I'm Tom Pullen, the Director of Professional Services, and today we'll be discussing some of the features and capabilities in Acumen Risk that you may not be familiar with as a user. And if you're not a user of the tool, it's a fairly good overview of the tool and the capabilities as well. So before we get started, let's talk briefly about the GoToWebinar control panel. We have some instructions on the screen right now to help you minimize the GoToWebinar window if you want to get it out of the way. You can raise your hand, but I think the best way to do questions today, given the large audience we have, would be to type your question into the chat window. Jen Weber, who's on the call as well, will be facilitating and even answering some questions as we go with the webcast, and she'll ask me some of the questions at the end as well. So anytime you have a question, just type it in, and if we're unable to get back to you during the webinar, I'll give you some more information on how you can contact us at the end of the session. If you were on our call yesterday, Tips and Tricks in Acumen Fuse, we talked a little bit about the company, and I'll do that again because we have some first-time people joining us today. Up top, you see our company name, Acumen, and beneath that is a word, analytics, proven project analytics. That's very important to us. We believe that project success most certainly requires a very sound plan. We don't think a project has a very high possibility of success if the plan that goes into that project is not extremely robust, well-reviewed, and bought into by the entire team. More on that in a couple of minutes. We've received some good recognition from our industry and beyond. In 2012, Planning Innovation of the Year and one of Inc. 500's fastest growing companies. Long legacy of thought leadership, and you can see on the right-hand side of the screen many trusted clients, many of whom are Fortune 500 companies and or leaders in their respective industries. Let's talk a little bit more about Acumen's view of the world. We're strong proponents in an S1 to S5 schedule maturity model that we've developed. You can see the S1 through S5 items down the left-hand side of the screen, and in the center of the screen we show you what we believe are the best solutions for each one of those. For instance, S1 is the schedule basis, which is in most cases the scheduling tool that you're using today if you are using one. We have some cost tools and risk tools listed there as well. That helps you get to your initial draft baseline schedule. From there, though, S2, which is a lot what we talked about yesterday, the critiqued schedule is, does it have the components, does it have the logic, does it rely too much on constraints, do the task durations and float tend to be very high? In other words, is it a plan that's setting itself up well technically for execution? Today, we're squarely focused on S3, which is a risk-adjusted schedule. This is where we can take into account probabilistic and deterministic reasons. More on those definitions in a bit. But we can take into account probabilistic and deterministic risks and determine if the end date for our project, which we've determined in S1 and S2, has credibility behind it based on the environment that our project's in. S4, which we're talking about tomorrow, Acumen 360, is all about project optimization and taking that risk-adjusted plan and turning it to something that's going to meet the goals of the project and the goals of your company. Finally, S5 is a team-approved and validated schedule that's been through the S1 through S4 steps and is now ready for communication and really project execution. So let's talk more about Acumen Risk in this S3 piece. We listed for you here some of the primary benefits, audience, and features. From the benefits standpoint, gaining insight into how you can reduce and control the risk on your project. The first step there is, of course, identifying the risks, and I'll show you how we do that in Acumen Risk. Insight into mitigation plans, which is very similar to setting up a risk, but it's a lighter version of the risk that has less impact to the project, but might require some expense. Finally, you'll develop improved project confidence if you do go through the risk process. Audience, risk analysts, project stakeholders, and project managers, really anyone who's on the project team who has some form of responsibility for execution should be involved in the risk management process. Otherwise, you don't have the assurance that all your risks are being taken into account. Some of the top features, which I'll be showing you today, and I'll be showing you a few more, are the ability to combine cost and schedule risk probabilities and impacts, integrating the risk register into your risk picture with what's known as the risk driver process, and of course identifying those risk drivers as well. My plan for today is, much as I did yesterday with Fuse, is talk about some concepts and then jump over to the application to bring those concepts to life. I always like to talk about what the tool can do, but I really like to show you, using the tool, what it can actually do. So first, many of you, like me, who've done risk management in the past, maybe just out of Excel or a spreadsheet, are familiar with the concept of a risk register. And when I go over into Acumen Risk, I'll show you exactly where the risk register can be built or imported into Acumen Risk. What we don't like to do at Acumen is tell you how to drive your process. We like to give you the tools and capabilities to incorporate what you consider to be a best practice process into Acumen Risk. So we're not controlling how you do business, but we can help facilitate how you do business. A great example of that is the risk register and the calibration process for the risk register. We recommend a 5x5 probability and impact matrix because we know that's what many companies are using. However, you have the flexibility to go as low as 3x3 or as high as 9x9, or even an asymmetrical arrangement such as 4x6. You also get to define a probability scale, and you can calibrate the impacts of risks either in terms of a number of days or percentage. Finally, you can determine thresholds and score your risks and determine what color each score should have assigned to them. The next step, after I, in the tool, set up our risk template, import some risks, and then what we'll do next is we're going to map those events to activities. And this is the core of the risk driver process. It's one thing to have a risk register, and virtually every project that I've worked on has had a risk register. It's another thing entirely when those risks on your register have impact to risk-adjusted scenarios based on your schedule. So when we say mapping risk events, we're not simply talking about having a field in your scheduling tool called risk number and putting the number of the risk in the risk matrix. We're talking about a risk driver and risk impact process where the probability of the risk occurring and the impact of the risk will be taken into account during the run of our Monte Carlo simulation-based tool, and you'll see a physical move in the schedule based on that probability and impact of risk occurrence. And I'm going to show you that. Also, and after this slide, we'll jump over into the tool. We don't just have threats. Those are the items that project teams tend to emphasize, and frankly, they're the most common occurrence. Most projects that I've worked on, I see more threats than see more threats than opportunities. But we have the capability to have opportunities. Also, we've recently added the capabilities to use weather modeling, which is in the form of both risk calendars and risk windows, which I'll be showing you as well. So in total, we have 4 types of risks, and I'll show you those. Okay. We'll get out of PowerPoint now, and we'll go into the tool. If you've used any of the products in our suite, you might be familiar with the screen that I've loaded now. Much like in our Fuse demonstration yesterday, I've loaded a file. In this case, I chose a Primavera file. I've imported it into the system. From here, I can do my Fuse diagnostics if I'd like, and I'll go ahead and just take an overall look at this schedule and see how it scores. Now, this schedule is not very good. It scores at 26%. It's missing some logic. It has some negative float. This project is not ideal for a risk workshop or risk exercise because there's quality problems with it. And that's what Fuse helps us understand. Now, this is a demonstration. I can do anything that I want. So I'm going to press on, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to do a risk simulation on this project, knowing that it doesn't have all the pieces in place to be a true S1 to S5 mature schedule. Now, the reason I went to Acumen Fuse first is to show you how I can seamlessly go from schedule diagnostics into our risk tool simply by clicking the S3 tab. But I'm looking at it with respect to risk. So let me expand out the project a little bit and show you what I have here. I have a number of summary tasks. I have kind of an indented structure based on my work breakdown structure. Now, we talked about that risk template, so let's go to that. And I talked about that 5x5 default matrix. And that's assigned here. I can adjust these, and it adjusts my matrix down below. I'm going to stick with the 5x5. It's what most people are familiar with. And then I can also adjust the scoring-based color threshold as well. So I can determine what's red, yellow, and green when it comes to scoring a risk. Now, first, let's talk about probabilities. For each risk in my risk register, I'm able to assign a probability from very low to very high. In fact, I can even rename these terms as well, again, to use the terminology that you're using as part of your risk process. And I can even customize the percentage that constitutes any of these values in the range from very low to very high. I'll stick with the defaults, but if I want to change these, it's as easy as selecting the numbers and overtyping it with the numbers that I want to use. Across the top, I have my impacts. Probabilities down the left, impacts across the top. My impact template is up here. Now, I said we can do the impacts one of two ways, and we can do it separately for cost and schedule. My impacts here, very low, means the impact will likely be less than 20 days of duration. Low will be between 20 and 40 days, 40 to 60, 60 to 80 respectively. Now, if I have a very large project and I might want to have the impacts based on percentage, I click this checkbox, and now it's a factor of the remaining duration rather than an absolute value that we're putting on the impact. We're putting a relative value, 100%, 50% relative to the remaining duration that's in there today. So medium risk assigned to an activity might have as high as a 50% increase in remaining duration to the task to which it's assigned. That'll start to make more sense as we start mapping these risks over to activities. Well, I don't even have risks yet, so we're even going to need risks. But before I even start loading risks into the system, I want to have a well-established, peer-reviewed template so that everyone understands when we say medium, they know what it means in terms of a numerical probability and a numerical impact value. Also down here is custom fields that I get to associate with a risk. Out of the box, we assign owner as one of our custom fields. That can be changed. We could add resolution date, we could add location, secondary owner. Anything we want to, we can add in these custom fields. Okay. We've been talking about our risk template. Let's talk about our risk register. In fact, let me do something different here. Let me open it up on the full screen. Okay. Excuse me. Now we can see the full benefit of our risk register. We can see it across the screen. Let me do something here to save a little bit of time. I'm going to import a risk register. It's a sample file that comes with our product, and appropriately it's called populated risk register. And that'll help me keep things moving here. I have about 24 risks in this risk register. Let me step through the risk definition. First, is the risk enabled? Is it an active risk that could affect my project? I may wish to maintain a library of risks that may or may not affect my project, and then I can enable them individually. Second, each risk gets a unique ID number. Third, and this is where those 4 types of risks come into play, I have threats, opportunities, calendar events, and risk windows, and I'll be reviewing these 2 specifically in addition to threats and opportunities. Threats and opportunities work much the same, however, they're opposites of each other. Whereas with a threat, I lose time on the project. With an opportunity, I have the potential to gain time on the project. Unfortunately, in this import file, I seem to only have threats and no opportunities. Not finally, but I have a name for the risk. And now here's where things start to get a little bit exciting. For each risk, based on the definitions of these terms in the template that we looked at previously, I can assign probability, schedule, and cost weightings to this risk. So if I think this risk has a very high probability of occurring on my program, I can select very high. Same with schedule impact, and the same with cost impact. Now, I had picked the absolute measures in terms of days. If I had selected percentages over on the template, I would see the percentages associated with each of these terms here as a reminder of how my matrix is set up. Same with cost, and that gives me an overall score. Now it's red, and 25 is my worst case score. My probability is the least desirable for a threat. My schedule impact is the least desirable, and my cost impact is the least desirable, which has left us with the worst possible score based on our scoring matrix. Now, mitigation is enabled for this risk, which means we have an alternate profile for this risk, assuming that we can carry out and successfully mitigate. We can put a description for our mitigation activities, and we can put a time and cost on our mitigation. This is very important. It's one thing to mitigate a risk. It's another thing to make sure that that mitigation is going to cost you less than the impact of the risk itself. If it doesn't, it's not worth mitigating. In this case, it costs us $5 million to bring this risk to a medium probability, still with a very high schedule and cost impact. So once we run the simulation, we'll have to determine whether we think reducing this risk from a probability of very high to medium represents a good value if we're going to spend $5 million mitigating. Moving over to the right, we can see this will reduce our score to the yellow zone, which is a score of 15. Each of these risks have their own name, they have their own ID number, they've been assigned a type, and they've had an assigned probability, and then schedule and cost impact. Now let's talk about those other 2 types of risks here. Risk event, we also call kind of a weather window. In our example file here, we've used hurricane window. And what we've done is we've said this is a period of time where work may not be able to be performed on certain tasks. We haven't identified those tasks yet. We're still just identifying the risk. And we've assigned a 3-point start date estimate of when we think hurricane season is going to strike. And then we've assigned a 3-point finish date window for when we think hurricane season will finish. It's up to you to determine what these dates are based on the information that's available to you. You can use a very tight range between the 3 dates, minimum, most likely, maximum. If the event's a certainty, if there's a lot of uncertainty, introduce a wider spread between those 3 dates so that your simulation will more accurately reflect real life. Finally, we have another option used often for weather as well. We call this one winter weather interruption. And when you choose calendar event, what it does is it gives you a calendar of the months of the year. You can assign which months the weather event is most likely to occur. And then within those months, you can select a probability and then a minimum, most likely, and maximum duration that impact from winter weather might take place. So here, mimicking more or less the East Coast of the United States, we've said December, January, and February are the most likely months to have a winter weather interruption, with January having an 80% probability of having an event that will either be 4, 6, or up to 8 days in duration. So more or less, in this model, we're planning on about 3 snowstorms, all of which will hamper our work activity for generally between 4 to 10 days. Let's see, in February, we think the likelihood is lower, and then has a window of potentially 3, 4, or 5 days. So what we try to do here is help you prepare for any contingency on your project and then show what that impact might be. Okay, let's talk about mapping. My preference with mapping, you can do this left to right or right to left. My preference is to put activities on the left-hand side of the screen and put my risk register on the right-hand side of the screen. And we accomplish that with this left panel and right panel interface that lets you control what you see on either side of the split view of the screen. As you use the tool, you'll develop your own favorite ways of arranging the items. Like I mentioned, I like to put the activities on the left and the risks on the right. So now what I'm able to do is take any one of my activities, groups of activities, or the entire project itself, and assign a risk at that level. So let's start at the most basic level, electrical design, which is an individual lowest level task in my schedule. I'm going to arbitrarily pick a risk over on the right-hand side here. And I've created a relationship between the two. In fact, this grid for that activity is now highlighted in green, which means this activity has been mapped to a risk that has a green category score. Now, if I take this civil design task, I can map it to this risk. Now, this risk was red, but if you recall, this top risk was mitigated to a score of yellow. So it's telling me here that I mapped to a risk which has a likely outcome of yellow. So we could spend a lot of time mapping individual activities to individual risks, and that might be the most appropriate thing. What we found, often an entire functional area or leg on the WBS might be affected by one or more risks. So in that case, what we can do is I can select a summary level task and have an individual risk drive and cascade through every task under that summary. And if I wanted to, I can go up to higher levels, all the way up to level 0 or level 1, whatever you call your project level, especially when it comes to maybe those hurricane or winter weather windows. If the entire project is done in a specific area which could be affected by weather, you might choose to have that winter weather affect all work on your project. Or maybe it's just the construction work, so you can create that relationship. In fact, as part of my import file, I already have construction mapped both to the hurricane and the winter weather interruption. Let's see, what else did I want to cover? We talked about the weather modeling. We talked about mapping risk events. Let's see here. Let's actually run. Let's do this. Let's create some uncertainty. This is probabilistic uncertainty, separate from our individual risks. This is the natural variation that we would expect to see in the durations of our tasks. There's a template, there's a methodology behind that. I'm going to set these to the center right now, and we're going to run our Monte Carlo simulation. And we'll see how much impact this risk and uncertainty is having to our project. What I've put up on the screen, based on our risk mappings and the uncertainty slider, the duration uncertainty that I've loaded into the project, we can see a probability distribution of finish dates for our project. And you can see they tend towards this region here, which is approximately April 21st to May 5th. The chart is nice. The statistical table down beneath gives us some more of the detailed information. The first notable piece of information down here is the deterministic finish date is 0%. Based on our risk profile and based on the duration uncertainties that we've assigned to our tasks, the system doesn't believe that we have any chance of finishing our project according to the original January 31st end date. It believes the average finish date through the simulations that it's run is April 25th. It's not far off from our January 31st date, but again, that's the ultimate best case that it was able to get through its Monte Carlo iterations. More likely is something towards April 29th, which is our 50% probability date. Our P75 date is May 9th, and our absolute worst case that it was able to determine was June 3rd. So what I need to do at this point is sit down with my project manager and determine if a 122-day finish date range is going to be acceptable to my team. Now, if my contractual finish date is in July of 2013, there might not be a problem. But if my contractual finish date was January 31st, 2013, we have to see if there's the possibility to mitigate some more of those risks and put some more plans in place to be able to meet the January 31st date. We might be able to trade some time for money or vice versa, but certainly what we have today, assuming we identified the right risks on the right activities, is not a plan that's going to lead us to success. Let's talk, that kind of brings me into the risk control panel. I've used one or two of the elements of our risk control panel, but I'm going to show you each of them. In fact, the one that I used quickly before I ran that Monte Carlo simulation was setting the uncertainties. And then we also have distribution types that you can set, the risk events themselves, which we've mapped, and then correlation between activities, and whether or not a task has a 100% probability of existing in the plan, or maybe only a 50 or 25% probability. What we've done is we've taken a number of these typical risk analysis settings and sliders, and we've put them in a single area of our user interface. The reason is to give you control over risk in your project, either from an individual activity level, or you can adjust any of these, or many of these, at the top level as well. For instance, the duration uncertainty, which is probably the one I'll spend the most time with here, I can set that at the top level, or I can set this down at the intermediate levels, and then finally down at the individual task level. This lets you set uncertainty on your project in a snap, because you can start with a benchmark value and then make adjustments by exception, instead of doing it the old way where you had to 10 key on your keyboard these minimum, most likely, and maximum duration values. What we're doing by moving these sliders is we're setting these values, but we're saving a lot of the typing. The way we do that is through the slider itself, and then the distribution type as well, to determine how the durations are going to be distributed across these scenarios. We show you if you've been mapped to a risk or not with the grid, or as I sometimes call it, the waffle. The percentage of existence of the task. By default, we make the very good assumption that all of the tasks in your schedule have a 100% chance of existence. You can change that to any number that you need to for any task in the schedule. We have an option to overcome the central limit theorem. If you believe you have an area of the schedule which has diverse uncertainty and is going to run through so many iterations that the uncertainty cancels itself out and keeps converging on the same answer, you can have those items actually, as the simulation runs, as they come up with different minimum, most likely, and maximum duration values, they'll tend towards the same side of the curve, so that they are working with each other in your Monte Carlo simulations, instead of one activity having one value and then another activity having an offsetting value for duration, so that you're not seeing a true picture of the reality that all those tasks might slip together at the same time based on the same event or uncertainty. Now we have another form of correlation as well, where I can cross boundaries. Instead of just working under summary tasks, I can correlate uncertainty between tasks that are anywhere in the schedule. So the tasks that I'm adding to this list that'll be correlated to requirements definition, as requirements definition has different duration values occur during the 1,000 or however many Monte Carlo iterations that you want, these activities will tend towards the same behavior. In fact, you can even determine with this correlation coefficient how often through the iterations these child activities will have the same behavior of uncertainty as the parent activity. Now, if you haven't used correlation before, I may have gone into too much detail. We've got more information available on our website, and on our YouTube channel we have very specific videos that go over some of these concepts. If you are familiar with correlation, you may very well be familiar with this type of matrix that you're seeing here on the screen. And really, with these 5 or 6 items here, I have control over the majority of the facets that are going to affect my risk simulation. I have everything here from the probability of various duration uncertainties, the probability of the task existing, the risk mapping, and then correlation, 2 forms of correlation between different activities. So I really have the ultimate level of control here. Now, one more thing with regard to that console is the risk advisor. Now, the risk advisor is special and different and new, so it gets its own slide. Many teams that we talk to who want to do risk analysis don't know where to get started. Those same teams, often with a lower level of maturity, don't always have high quality schedules at the same time. Now, one thing through a lot of research and through our benchmarking utility we determined at Acumen is a lower quality plan has a higher risk of program execution, on-time program execution. A higher quality schedule has a higher confidence that we'll be able to execute on time. Now, we know that we've proven that out. With the risk advisor, we've built that knowledge into the software to do exactly what it says here. Recommend uncertainty settings on schedule quality, which is my favorite way to use it, but we can do it based on past performance, any individual metric result, or any field that you're tracking in your schedule as well. And I'll show you the console for that in a moment. Also, the risk advisor, I can't say this enough. They are recommendations. You can put them in place, but you always must remember that they're recommendations as well. They're recommendations that you can throw away if you don't like them, but for me, I like running it regardless, even if I'm not sure I'm going to use the recommendations, because it's an objective checkpoint versus the uncertainties that I've assigned manually. I'll show you exactly how it does that. Okay, we've assigned our own uncertainties to this project. Now and when I say uncertainties, I mean these sliders, and it's the duration uncertainty that I'm baking into these different activities and different summaries. Now, if you recall, let's go back over to Fuse for a second. This schedule has some quality issues. And what I'm going to ask the risk advisor to do is based on the inferior level of quality that I have in this schedule. What does the system believe my end date might be for individual activities and the schedule as a whole? So let's go back over to Acumen Risk. And I'll click this Risk Advisor. And remember those 4 items I talked about. Schedule quality, which is my favorite, and it's the default. I can use the historical performance in my schedule, current performance versus baseline, to have it assume that that level of performance is what's going to continue. I happen to be working with a schedule baseline here, so I won't get information from there. Any one of the hundreds of fuse metrics, like logic hotspot, can be used to assign uncertainty to an activity. Logic hotspot's actually a good one to use. We've determined that if an activity has a high number of predecessors and or a high number of successors, not only is it a logic hotspot, but it's a risk hotspot as well. It's an area of the project that if it slips out into the future, will have downstream impact up to and including the finish date of the project. Finally, any field in your project. You may already be using a field that has a value that has a level of risk associated with it. Maybe you're doing some form of risk analysis today, but not quite to this level. You can use values that you're putting in any user-defined text or code field in your project and have those affect the risk simulation. Now, I could spend all day going through the risk advisor, and I'd be more than willing to because I really like it. But for the sake of the demo today, I'm going to use schedule quality, which we know is low for this schedule, to perform these recommendations. Calculate advice, and wow, it came back with a lot of red. Now, it didn't adjust my sliders at all. Those have stayed absolutely intact the way we had set them manually. There's some green down below. There's some bright spots. So what I'm able to do, either at the project level, which I'll do, but at the summary or the activity level, I can assign the individual suggestions to each activity in the schedule. And now that I've done that, you can see these sliders have, many of them have moved to dark red. Some of them have moved to light red, and some of them have moved to light green. Let's run our Monte Carlo simulation again, keeping in mind that our mean prior to this risk advisor exercise, our mean finish date was about April 25th, and our worst case was in early June. Let's run it again. I have it set for 1,000 iterations. It's just about complete. Okay, there it goes. Bad news. Our mean finish date is now out in May, and our worst case is now in August from June. Now, the only change that we've made is we used the risk advisor to make recommendations on uncertainties instead of our own. The risk advisor doesn't know everything. It knows the schedule quality, and it's prepared to make adjustments based on schedule quality. So now I have two data points that I can sit down and discuss with the project manager. I have the team's input on duration uncertainty and risk matrix, and now I have the schedule advisor taking a stern look at our schedule quality and determining that our finish date might not be as good as we thought it was. In fact, it might be worse. Now, we can't govern based on the risk advisor, but we can take its impact seriously. We can go back over to Fuse. We can understand what the issues are, tie that missing logic together, remove those constraints, understand why we had negative float in the baseline, hopefully remove it, create a new schedule, bring it back into Acumen Risk, run the risk advisor, and see if we end up in a better case scenario than we did with the lower quality schedule. For those of you who are familiar with the term cost of poor quality, we can look at that right here, both from a duration cost and from a financial cost, which is actually one of our next topics. This screen we looked at. In fact, we looked at it a couple different times. We showed the confidence of finishing on different end dates. We showed the probability histogram. I can show contingency to a certain confidence level as well. In this example, we need 15 days of contingency in our schedule to meet the desired confidence level. I don't want to rehash this because I have a couple more topics I want to get to before we go to questions. And one of those topics is maybe it's just one more topic. Oh, no, that's risk sensitivity. Well, we have two topics, but they're related. Integrating cost and schedule. We've looked at this point at the duration uncertainty and probable finish dates for our project. Our risk system, Acumen Risk, speaks the language of both schedule and cost, and it gives a clever way to integrate the two if you don't already have resource and cost loaded schedules. For the first time, we can do cost and schedule integrated risk analysis using separate files. In fact, the file that I'm going to use for my cost is an Excel file that's actually at a higher level than my detailed schedule. So not only can I work from different sources with cost and schedule, is they don't even need to be maintained at the same level of detail. And I'll show you how we do that. It's pretty clever. And here's a picture representing what I've just talked about, but what it shows us is we're going to develop our own cost model, but then what we're going to also do is have the schedule drive certain areas of that cost model to create even more uncertainty by combining our inherent cost uncertainty with our schedule uncertainty. And finally, what we'll do to analyze that is we'll pull up this risk sensitivity chart, which is going to show us on the x-axis our probable finish dates. On the y-axis, it's going to show us our probable costs and how all those simulation results fell. In fact, I'm even going to show you in our manual, in our instruction manual, where we have a little bit of a cheat sheet to remind you what each of these four quadrants means. So let's go over here. Just like I opened my Primavera schedule earlier, I happen to have a file called sample cost risk. I'm telling it based on WBS information that's coded into the Excel file, telling it to create a hierarchy. It understands punctuated significant and other types of work breakdown structures. And what I can do is I can just go in here and I can confirm what I've loaded in. I have 4 level 2 WBS items: G&A, drilling, subsea, and platform. And from there I can to the individual cost records. Let's go over to Acumen Risk. The first thing I'll do is I'll assign some general cost uncertainty just to establish a benchmark for my cost model. What I've done is I've told the system that our costs are realistic. Now it'll use the distribution to assign different values every time through the Monte Carlo simulation, and we're going to get the same kind of histogram as we had before, but instead of dates, we have dollars. We have a deterministic 55% chance of hitting our deterministic cost. We have best case, P50, P75, just like we had with schedule, we have now with cost. I can even assign cost risks to these individual cost items. I can change my uncertainty values. Anything that I did from the schedule standpoint, I can do from the cost standpoint. Except on the cost side, I can do even one more thing. There's an extra button on the cost side, which is called cost schedule integration. I'm going to take my G&A, general and administrative, and I'm going to tell it to integrate with the top level of the schedule. Now, why would I do that? What does that mean? That means that as the schedule expands or contracts in length, the G&A cost is going to rise and fall accordingly. If this project takes an extra year to execute according to the risk simulation, I'm going to have an extra year worth of G&A cost. Now, G&A isn't one of my larger expenses, so as I run this again, I was at 55% before. We'll see if this even changed the deterministic impact by a percent or two, or maybe more. We'll see what happens when we come out of the simulation. If it doesn't have enough impact for us, we'll assign some more uncertainty or do some more mapping over to the schedule. Oh dear, it did. It took us down considerably. Now we only have an 11% chance of meeting our target cost. Oh, that's right. When we ran the risk advisor, many of our sliders moved over to red. So what we did is we took a fairly certain cost model and we linked it over to a fairly uncertain schedule. So what that's done is it's rippled the uncertain schedule into the uncertainty of our cost, and we see a much less favorable scenario than we ran cost on its own. Now, I don't like seeing 11%, but I'm glad I've got the capability to see 11% instead of blissfully moving along with my first answer, which was 55%. Now I've got decisions to make because this is very unlikely that I'm going to meet my target cost. Let's run this again through our joint confidence level risk sensitivity chart, see if we can make some sense of it. Okay, we've got two quadrants because we don't even have any data points in the good two quadrants. We're just seeing the I don't know, for lack of a better term, what we'll call the bad two quadrants. These are all of our cost outcomes, and then these are all of our schedule outcomes, and then here they are plotted as data points on this matrix. And I'll show you my own cheat sheet. It's actually in our instruction manual. If I can get myself down to page 122. In our manual, we equip you with this very handy chart. With ours, we're looking at the top two quadrants. It shows you what data points in each of the quadrant mean. For instance, this upper left-hand quadrant is cost greater than deterministic, but finish more favorable than the deterministic value. Now, the upper right-hand quadrant is exactly where you don't want to be because the cost is greater than the deterministic value and the finish is greater than the deterministic. So this is the worst case scenario right here. Knowing that, go back to our simulation. Oh, you can see the majority of our values fall within the upper right-hand quadrant, knowing that our two quadrants below aren't even shown because we don't have data points in them. And then in addition, we can add the joint confidence level, and we can tweak this as well to show, for instance, where 90% of my results fall. They all fall under this cost and then under this area of schedule. So I have a 90% chance of ending up as one of these data points with one of these costs and then one of these schedule outcomes. If I want, I could see, 10% case, if everything goes extremely well, I'll end up in one of these outcomes, but it's very unlikely. It only has a 10% chance that I'm going to be in this upper yellow zone, and I have a 0% chance of being in the green zone. Where does this schedule stand in terms of risk? Not good. Step number one, right off the bat, is to improve the quality of the schedule. There's no scenario where I want to proceed with 11 missing logic items, especially given the fact that I only have 56 tasks in this schedule. I've got negative float in my baseline, and I have hard constraints in lieu of logic. So that's red flag number one. Red flag number two is my risk matrix seemed to have a lot of impact on my program. Combining that with the quality information that came out of the risk advisor, moving my uncertainty sliders to the right, and how that will compound into our cost picture, which on its own had a 55% probability, but once we schedule adjusted it, only had 11%. So for better or for worse, in this demonstration, we've created a recipe for disaster. But the good news is we have the tools and we have the equipment here to be able to determine that and to know that we should not proceed into execution with this project. We should not leave the S3 phase. And let's go back to our S1 to S5. We shouldn't leave S3 at all right now because we don't have a plan that we have confidence in. In fact, we really never should have left the critique, the quality aspect as 2, because we scored 26% on our quality score. We have missing logic, hard constraints, all those other no-nos when we go into a risk exercise. So like I said, the good news is we have the tools, we have the capability to be able to determine that, and if we go back, we iterate back through, and we come through with high schedule quality, and we have the right risks and we have the right mitigation applied, instead of seeing 11% on our deterministic cost, we might see something as high as 80% or even higher than that. Those are the tips and tricks that I wanted to talk to you about today. We're going to take questions in a minute to see if Jen has collected any during the session, but I'll put this slide up on the screen for a moment, and I'll put it up at the end after questions as well. This is where you can find more information. I mentioned before, we have white papers and videos that go over the basic functionality of Acumen Risk and our other products. Those are on our website, which you can see on our screen. You can reach out to us on Twitter, and you can always email us as well at info@projectacumen.com. So Jen, have any good questions come in during the session?
Yeah, absolutely. First, I just want to mention that today's webinar was the second in a 3-part series we're doing this week. So if you have not signed up for tomorrow's webinar, which will be tips and tricks in Acumen 360, I'm about to send the link to do so in the chat, so you can go ahead and register for tomorrow. And also, once we've completed all 3 webinars, I guess after tomorrow's webinar, we'll send out recordings of each presentation along with the slides to everyone that attended. So our first question was about the risk register, and it asked, how are opportunities from the risk register handled or applied during the risk analysis?
Okay, and that's something I talked about. That's a really good question, because it's something I talked about, but I really didn't show off. So what you will do is, let me go back over to the schedule. They work exactly the same way as the threats work, but they work the opposite. The probability is still the probability, but the impact is based on how much time you will gain rather than how much time you'll lose. And how do you know if you have a risk or opportunity? Well, you either have the green thumbs up for an opportunity or you have the red thumbs down for a threat.
Okay. The next one is, what does the populated risk register spreadsheet look like, and do you have to have the same headings in your spreadsheet when you're importing for the risk register?
Great question. I didn't want to go there. I'm going to open Excel. Let's see. Oh, I even have it in my file history. Perfect. Okay, here's exactly what it looks like. And we actually give you 2 files with the product. We give you a populated risk register, which I use all the time, even as a template, and we have a template version, which is the same exact file, but it's blank. Normally what I do if I'm importing a risk register from another source is I open the populated one and I start pasting in the information down beneath. And the reason I keep the populated one is I make sure my information matches the same type of information that's up above. The answer to the second part of the question is yes. Keep the structure that we have in the template file intact. Make sure that you're putting similar information under similar columns, and it'll come right into Acumen Risk. Oh, and one more thing that I'll mention. You don't need to import the score and some of the other information that our system calculates for you. Basically, at a minimum, the system needs an ID. Now, that won't get you much. What I recommend is importing about the level of information that I've highlighted here. But if not, I could even just go here and then adjust my pull downs in the Acumen Risk tool instead of assigning those values here in Excel.
Okay. The next question was on the risk sensitivity chart, and it asked, can you flip the axis on the JCL scatter plot to show the schedule on the x-axis?
Yes, the control is all yours. I'll show you that screen. I went quickly through it to get the plot up on the screen. But you can you can pick exactly which project and then which value you want to track on either axis. So you would simply select the schedule project y-axis. You can even show relationships between sensitivity between two different tasks in the schedule. You can go schedule to schedule, you can go cost to cost. The most common method is to go schedule to cost, and like I said, you can select here on the setup screen which axis you have which on.
Okay. And the next question is just, I guess, general best practices. It asks, at what stage of the project do you recommend doing a risk analysis?
Early and often is my recommendation, and I kind of mean that in seriousness. Oftentimes you do have to pick a stage of the project where you do a risk event. I've seen that done successfully pre-baseline, and then after the baseline is solidified. I've seen that happen successfully. It might not be the best case, but I've seen it happen successfully several months into the project. And the reason why that can be useful is you have some real data at that point, and you know more about what's going to happen on the project. That brings me back to early and often. You can only gain by doing this baseline and again during early to mid project execution.
Okay. The next one I can answer, it asks, can you get credit for participation for continuing education? This webinar is, I believe, category B PDUs for PMI, and when tomorrow we'll send you a follow-up email with details on how to claim those. So, and then it looks like this is our last question. It asks, in the discrete risk template, the cost and or duration impact fields allow for a min and a max value. What distribution is being used with these values during simulation?
It's a uniform distribution. As the simulation runs, in the case of low, it will select a value between 10 and 20 days, randomly, with each value in that range having an equal chance of occurring during an individual Monte Carlo run. 1,000 iterations, I'd expect from a statistical perspective that each value between 10 and 20 days will have been used multiple times for a risk that has a rating of low.
And it might be worth mentioning that you can switch these to percentage-based as well, so you don't have to have finite numbers for the values. You can actually do a percentage of duration or a percentage of cost.
Yep, they can be switched to percentage, and then what you're also able to do, this is a little more in-depth, and we've got some videos on this, is for individual activity to risk relationships, you can override the template and change the values manually when you have some more specific information about a specific relationship between activity and risk.
All right. Well, thank you, Tom, for the presentation, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. Again, if you haven't had a chance to sign up for tomorrow's webinar, it'll be the same time, and it will cover tips and tricks in the Acumen 360. So we hope to see you then.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, everyone.